Okay, how about we get started? Good morning, everyone. Let me also welcome you to this event. My name is Nikos Trichakis, and I'm going to be moderating this panel on OR in public policy. So I just wanted to start by posing a few broad questions here. Should marijuana be legal, and what are the effects of drug legalization on crime? In view of the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, how should we think about FEMA's budget? Should the US have a tougher immigration policy? And do undocumented immigrants come with higher criminality? Should biometric identification be used to deter fraud, crime, and how effective is it? Now, posing these questions would, in general, prompt people to probably put on their political hats and possibly engage in endless political debates. But at the same time, I think that for people in this room, posing these questions would also prompt certain neurons in the brain to start firing, particularly those on the left side associated with math. So the point here is that these questions are just a small sample of public policy questions that are very, very closely related with operations research. And my hope with this session is that it will illustrate the great synergies that there are between operations research and public policy. Now, the Operations Research Center at MIT has been at the forefront of this area, particularly through the 4 distinguished alums that we have here joining us. So let me take this opportunity to, first of all, thank them for being here. So please join me. So John Colkins, Özlem Ergun, Ed Kaplan, and Larry Vine. Larry, I'm taking the liberty of including you as a faculty alum. So the way we decided to run this is straightforward, is as follows. Each panelist is going to take first 15 minutes to make an opening statement. And then we're going to use the remainder of the time for a Q&A and open discussion. So for the opening statement, I asked each panelist to, first of all, broadly share with us their experience, but also possibly comment on why they think public policy is an exciting area for operations research and vice versa, and also possibly comment on past successes and missed opportunities that our community has had, and what we have learned from these experiences. And afterwards, we can kind of going to use the remainder of our time to hopefully collectively think about future opportunities and challenges in this area. So without further delay, I would like to ask our first panelist to come to the stage and join us. And there are 2 ways I can do the introductions. I could probably take half of the time of the panelists' time to list all their accomplishments, or be brief and kind of let them do the talking. I've opted for the latter. So being brief here, I would like to invite John Colkins, an MIT graduate and a professor at CMU.
All right. So the brief introduction for me is I do drugs. I have for about 30 years, and it's been a rewarding career. So the first question I'm supposed to address is, why is public policy an exciting opportunity for operations research? And I think the answer is, it is the most cost-effective way somebody with an OR background can spend their career. The most bang for the buck by the following metric. In terms of value created for society per year of your life worked, the opportunities are tremendous. That's not because any of us are smart. It's because public policy is so screwed up. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And frankly, there are not very many people with R training working in that area. And so a diminishing returns principle applies that makes it easy for us to have a big impact. I didn't know you were going to ask, should marijuana be legalized and what will the effect on crime be? But I'll work in the second one now. Tell a little anecdote. So in 2010, California had the first proposition with serious possibility of passing legalizing a for-profit commercial cannabis industry. Colleagues and I analyzed it, published a document predicting how it would turn out. In the week after we produced this document projecting what would happen to markets in the United States and so on, we got calls from, or I was pretty sure I got this right, it was the Mexican ambassador to the United States, the US ambassador to Mexico, the president of Mexico's chief domestic policy advisor, and the president of Mexico's chief national security advisor all called and said, great report, but what will it do for Mexico? And the reason Mexico was so interested is cannabis does drive a lot of violence in Mexico. It does not much in the United States. And the story there is just psychopharmacologically doesn't generate much violence, but anything worth $1 billion is worth shooting someone over when it's illegal. And that's the play in Mexico. But that little anecdote indicates the influence that just one study can have. And I think all of us have experienced that throughout our career in some form or another. So that's why public policy is exciting for us. Second question was, how can OR help public policy? And I think the short answer is by bringing a systems perspective. In that sense, almost any engineering training has a lot to offer public policy. And I'll try to illustrate this with two examples. The first is one of the earliest in my career where I know I had a substantial impact. In the early 1990s, there was a strategy of law enforcement that was very popular called crackdowns. It basically meant trying to arrest as many retail sellers in a given city as possible on one weekend. It would sort of gorge the criminal justice system with this bolus of people being arrested, and it was very costly, but the idea was that this was going to disrupt the market in a way that you would not achieve by just arresting people in ones and twos, because it would be easy to replace them. And so I had conversations with chiefs of police in many major American cities where they would say, last weekend we arrested 150 people all at once. Won't this rattle the market? And I said, no. And they said, why do you say that? How do you know? And I said, well, let's do some arithmetic. Dollar value of retail sales for the hard drugs, leaving cannabis out of it, about $50 billion a year. The average retail seller working full-time sold at that time about $50,000 a year. You can do the math. That's about 1 million full-time equivalent people selling retail. A lot of people sell part-time, so there's about 1.5 individuals for every full-time person, so we're at about 1.5 million. Typical major American city might have 1% of the country's population, say 3 million or so, and I would say, do you think that you have a smaller than average drug problem compared to the rest of the country? And none of them said yes, so I said, excellent, move the decimal places 2 spots. From 1.5 million to 150,000, and then back to 15,000 if you're 1% of the country. That's the denominator. You just put in the numerator only 100 or 150 in an operation that seriously strained the criminal justice system. No, I don't think that taking down 10% of an easily replaceable resource is going to be a crippling blow to that distribution system. No one ever challenged that. Everybody I told that to change their policy. Simple arithmetic from a systems perspective can be very powerful. I'll give a second example because you asked about should cannabis be legalized. That has been one of the focuses for me for the last decade. One of the single biggest contributions that I made was taking all of our tools for modeling production and distribution chains that we would normally apply to Ford Motor Company, and I apply it to other folks like terrorists and human traffickers, and you can apply it prospectively to what the cannabis industry would look like after legalization. And the story is pretty simple. Cannabis is a plant. It's no harder to grow than tomatoes. In fact, in various ways, tomatoes are a good analog. So you can just figure out how much product is produced per square foot. The answer is about 40 grams per harvest. And you can figure out what's the cost of growing tomatoes per square foot, and you can divide. And the result of that division is a cost of production that is about 1% of the going retail price of the cannabis. And so we made a prediction 10 years ago. If you legalize on a for-profit commercial model, you will see prices drop. People didn't believe it initially. it has proved true. It's not rocket science forecasting the future if you've got a perspective that other people don't. Anyhow, that's what I think OR can offer public policy. The third question was, what are past successes and missed opportunities? And I don't think I want to try to run through particular examples, either from my own career or more generally. There are lots. They're wonderful and exciting and inspiring. I'm going to try to abstract a little bit. When has OR made big contributions? When has it had more difficulty? I think the first observation is that it's a lot easier for OR to inform public policy in a domain where there is a clear top-down hierarchical leadership with centralized decision-making authority. The military is the paradigmatic example there. There's no question that operations research is routinely used by militaries around the world to make all sorts of decisions, everything from organizing the logistics and supply chains to deciding what weapons to acquire to figuring out strategy. By contrast, I think it's a lot harder when the locus of decision-making is diffuse. I'm working now some on wildlife trafficking. That is a domain in which there is nothing approaching a single authority that gets to make decisions. That is a collective action problem that spans many different countries, and even within the countries, many different departments or organizations. It's a lot harder for OR classically to make a difference in that second kind of domain. And regrettably, there are a lot of public policy domains that are not owned by just one department. Take homelessness. There's not a single homelessness czar who really has power in that issue. And if you run down the issues that we care about, most obviously global warming, there's not a czar who has the power to make all the command and control decisions in some of those domains. So that's one. A second sort of related maybe is how technically trained are those decision makers? Are the key decision makers engineers, scientists, people who speak algebra at least? If so, it's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier. And that'd be true if you're advising the EPA, for instance, or the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, or the military. By contrast, if the key decision makers are scared of algebra, it's harder. I have spent much of my career informing decision makers who were scared of algebra. And there's an art to trying to figure out how to have models be persuasive when people fundamentally mistrust models and believe that they are tools for lying, not tools for informing. It helps to be a little Irish. It helps to be a storyteller at times like that. A third characteristic is whether or not the problem being analyzed is operational or tactical. That plays to our strength, versus strategic, not so much. And here I'll give another example of a sort of simple benefit cost kind of calculation that I've done that's deeply depressing, but at the same time it's better to be informed even if you're depressed. This comes from human trafficking. One of the two most common interventions is to try to, quote unquote, rescue a victim of sex trafficking. This is to sort of reach in, pull them out of their milieu, provide a whole bunch of support services so they can get back on their feet. In round terms, that costs taxpayers about $100,000 per sex trafficking victim rescued. What do you think the replacement cost is for the organization that just lost that asset and needs to replace it? Even in the United States, $1,000 would be high. And in countries with lower GDP per capita, it can be lower than that. So that tactic is spending about 100 times as many taxpayer dollars per dollar of cost inflicted on the businesses, where what you're trying to do is drive up their cost of business to push up the price to reduce the market clearing volume. It's a tough road to hoe. It's a worse ratio than is even seizing drugs. So an operations research analysis that set out to try to figure out how to increase the number of people rescued, which I have seen, or that sought to use predictive analytics to try to predict which people would be most constructive to rescue, is an exercise in becoming more efficient it's something that is not effective. It's like deciding you're going to walk faster, but in the wrong direction. And I think that in public policy, it's often the case that we need to think about effectiveness issues, not just efficiency issues. We need to operate at the strategic level. And that can be done with models, absolutely, and calculations, like the thing I just said. But it isn't really the thing that comes first from our perspective necessarily. And related to that also is this notion of computing the optimal solution as opposed to informing decision makers. In a hierarchical organization that trusts the analyst, that decision maker might delegate to the analyst and the analyst software the authority to make a decision. In strategic decision making in messy public policy domains that are not owned by any one organization, that doesn't work as well. My general experience when I go to Washington, D.C. is that if I speak to our elected representative and say, X star is 17, therefore you should do this, it's your obligation to implement the strategy that I have computed. That does not get me invited back. It's much more a game of trying to inform by improving their worldview, trying to take some of our system's way of thinking and communicating that to the decision makers so they're empowered with that sort of worldview. So those are thoughts on where there are successes and where there are failures. And I think I have 2 minutes left. The last question was, what can we learn from this as a community? And I think that we should be extremely optimistic, and I would encourage students here to consider embarking on a career informing public policy. It's terrifically rewarding. But I think there is sometimes a tension, because often the biggest payoffs working in public policy come from things like that simple math. And that simple math, of course, is not going to be publishable in our flagship journals. And often being able to do that and to even know that you want to do that division requires quite deep domain knowledge. So there is this question about whether or not you're an operations researcher who does sometimes work in another area, or whether you go native and you truly become a domain expert in that area. And I think we as a field kind of need to wrestle with what role we want to play in those dual careers. The constructive suggestion I would make in this regard is the following, because it's really, really hard to convince ourselves that we ought to publish papers that involve long division in any particular application domain, no matter how voyeuristically interesting. But a general observation is that I think I've seen a lot of a disjunction between decision makers' perceptions of how they live their lives and make decisions and our textbook models. Our textbooks, they always have these cases that say, Joe's a production manager, he has to decide this, and then it's a relatively small step from that to our equations. But when I teach executive ed, I like to ask every one of my students at one time or another, tell me about the decisions you make, tell me how you think about decision making. And I get long, long essays that are discussions of challenges and problems. They're not always quite the way we think about decisions. So my one suggestion for the profession is that we do more anthropology of decision making. We allow ourselves somehow within our profession to have more people who just go out and interview decision makers and let them talk about how they think about decision making. And we open up our minds and our textbooks to trying to develop some methods that meet them where they are, rather than asking what subset of all the problems out there match to one of the chapters in Hillier and Lieberman. There are undoubtedly many great problems out there. You can make a career matching Hillier and Lieberman chapters to those problems. But I think that the space covered by that is a small subset of the opportunity that people like us with a systems perspective have to do real good, generating, as I said, a lot of bang for the buck in terms of value created for the world per year of our time. And I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. Thanks.
Ok, Okay, thank you, John. So our second speaker is going to be Özlem Ergun. So Özlem graduated from MIT. Then she spent quite a few years at Georgia Tech, and since 2014, I believe, she's been back in the Boston area. She's on the faculty at Northeastern. So please welcome Özlem.
All right, thank you. So I was at Georgia Tech for like more than a decade, so more than a few years. But what I would like to talk about today is all the questions that Nikos asked us, but through an example, because usually that's the best way that I can convey something. That's my style. And I was thinking at a high level, I completely agree with everything that John said, and maybe now I can be the TA who can demonstrate through an example of how those all kind of worked out in my career. And the one example that I wanted to pick up is my work in global food aid, supply chain work in the global food aid. So not necessarily domestic public policy, but global humanitarian response policy. So the first thing, I think, well, one of the last things that John said, but I think the first thing that I want to mention is that it takes, I believe, to make a real impact in public policy really takes a long time and a big education on our part, because at the end of the day, nobody really, I mean, there are a lot of low-hanging fruits, and you really have to pick up the low-hanging fruits first, I think. You can never go and try to solve all the problems with this high-dimensional mathematics. Nobody's going to listen to you. So you really have to go slow, and you really have to go while educating yourself and understanding where all the stakeholders are coming from in these domains. Because you have to be sensitive to the stakeholders' objectives and situations as well. Otherwise, we can prove a lot of things, but nobody would ever listen. So the thing that I want to talk about is supply chain optimization in food aid supply chains. So the first thing that I had to be educated about was how a supply chain looks in a humanitarian response setting. So we all know how a supply chain looks in a traditional supply chain. We know the goal, deliver the right things at the right time, blah, blah. So 10 years ago, I show up at the World Food Programme's headquarters in Rome, very excited about doing something within the humanitarian sector. At the time, we were thinking about starting a big effort at Georgia Tech with some of my colleagues, and somehow I got this meeting and an in with the WFP, the World Food Programme, which is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. So I show up, and the first thing I had to learn was, no, the supply chains don't look like that. There's a big difference. And the biggest difference is that a supply chain in the humanitarian sector always starts with a donation, right? And you might think that that's a small difference, but it's not. It makes the difference of a night and day. And the fact that nothing gets mobilized until a donation is confirmed. And when is a donation confirmed? It's confirmed after an emergency or an event happens, right? So imagine running a huge global supply chain with no contracts, with no pre-positioning, no advanced purchasing, nothing. And then you try to mobilize and respond to millions of people within 3 days. It seems quite crazy, but 10 years ago when I went to WFP, this is how it was exactly. And then the goal is also slightly different in the sense that it's really, they're looking at cost effectiveness of what they're doing. And cost effectiveness is really different than cost efficiency. So cost efficiency is that you have a goal and you try to maximize profits or minimize the cost, right? And cost effectiveness is really looking at, and there's a big debate about cost effectiveness in the sector, but it's, from my take, it's really looking at how effective, were your services to service one person or a population or to eradicate a disease, right? So it's very different. And so if you look at, I was sitting there, 10 years ago at the headquarters, and I'm thinking, World Food Program, it procures from everywhere in the world. It serves 80 different countries, and it does no pre-planning. Nothing starts before a donation. And then the dollar figures are crazy too, right? Even just the procurement or transportation and logistics costs annually is over billions of dollars. So it's a big company, well, it's a big organization with a lot of things moving around and a lot of money being served, and then lives at stake with no pre-planning. So, and then my immediate reaction was to say, like, you must be crazy, let me tell you how it can be done. Of course, that never works. And the first thing that one has to understand is, like, why is this the case? And this is the case because these organizations, including, I would say, most of the government, domestic government organizations I worked with here, are very risk averse, right? Nobody wants to put in their own dollar or a donated dollar into something that they don't know for sure is going to be used, right? So nobody wants to buy something before there's a need. Nobody wants to use their own dollar to buy something and move it to, I don't know, Mombasa, because they think it will be used at one point. So our job was then to really sit down with the logistics and procurement people and try to come up with a study that will demonstrate to them what would be the impact of, let's say, advanced purchasing, pre-positioning, using your own dollar maybe as a revolving fund to actually buy things before something happens. So that was my first thing in 2008 with advanced purchasing at WFP. And we were able to do a nice white paper, never published, because it wasn't anything that was, that was really hard to do from our perspective. And but at the end, we did convince them. Well, it wasn't just us. There was a group who was a proponent to this idea, but we were able to support this group with actually putting numbers behind the impact. So we were able to say about 5% more efficiency and effectiveness by putting together about a 60 million yearly annual fund from WFP's own budget. And after that, we spent about 2 years on this, and we were able to convince WFP organization to actually do a pilot study in Mombasa, and they were able to get some foreign dollars to be able to conduct that pilot, and it worked. And now, if you look at WFP, they actually have, well, I'll have some slides out for this later on, but they do advanced purchasing. They have a financing mechanism for doing this. So that has nothing to do with OR. It was kind of, the OR really helped to convince them that this was actually worthwhile, and they have to then figure out how to do the financing mechanism. So from then on, we moved on to supply chains, like supply chain optimization. So this is another project in about 2012. And so the next thing that was kind of like I had to learn that was really interesting and kind of crazy for me was the fact that every different group in WFP worked on its own. So like the food basket programming group did a design for a project completely on their own without really talking to anybody in sourcing, logistics, nobody, right? It's just the nutritionists working with the development people trying to come up with a food program. So they might put corn into the basket, or let's say they might put lentils into the basket, whereas yellow split peas could be as good and really abundantly available in the locale or like in the global markets without really talking to anybody and not being aware of this. Then the modality groups, which is the group who usually decides should we give cash and vouchers or should we actually buy the food basket, will make their own decision without really talking to many people, right? And then everything goes into procurement, and the procurement decides on the sourcing, looking at the global, regional, local markets. And then finally, the poor logistics people, who were usually the people I talked to, decided on how to actually get the things into the into places where the needy can actually get access to them. And of course, we said like, oh, are you crazy? This is really not a good way of doing it. Let's actually put everybody together, come up with an optimal solution. And, with me and I was still at Georgia Tech at the point, and a group of my students, we were actually able to put together a tool, kind of a prototype tool, and we were able to do a lot of cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis about what you would gain if you did these kind of collective, or instead of sequential, but kind of a simultaneous decision making. And it was very successful. So in terms of the math, it wasn't a division, but it was just a multi-period, multi-commodity supply chain, like a network optimization problem with some integer constraints. Maybe the challenge was everything had to be open source. So we did everything open source. And we had to be efficient, so we did some algorithmic advances, but nothing that would ever get me published in one of our flagship journals. So that was nice. And then let me tell you what happened. That was 2012, so 6 years afterwards. So what happens next, usually? And this is something that happens to me all the time. So this is just an example. The first thing was data. So the data infrastructure did not exist. And we spent about 4 to 5 years. And this is when I say we, I was really not that big of a part of this thing, but I was kind of in a supporting role. WFP had to spend 4 to 5 years building the right infrastructure for the data. And I would say, although the optimization model didn't directly interact with this, the optimization model was the guide for them to really understand what kind of data that they would have to have and update and have available in an automated way to make these decisions. So again, bringing some structure into the decision-making process was done by the optimization. The second thing was the human resource. There was nobody in these organizations, usually, including the United States government. There almost never anybody who has any technical or methodological background in the supply chain groups at the very least. And so we really had to convince them to build the human resources as well. And if you look at the group at WFP right now, there are about 12 people in the supply chain division who's supporting optimization work. And 5 to 6 of them actually have operations research background, and a lot of them with masters. So, and if you think about it, for a global organization, it's not too many people, but it went from 0 to that. The second thing is the change management. There's a lot of resistance. You really have to work with them and hold their hands and then convince people that this is something worth doing. And now, if you look at WFP, logistics and procurement being completely separate units, went from being completely separate units to being kind of joined under a supply chain division. Just to give you the drastic kind of the change, when I first went to WFP, the logistics group would actually send with me one of their members to go and meet with procurement, because procurement wouldn't meet with logistics on its own. So they were like actually seeing me as somebody that they can, help them to talk to procurement. So big change management issues there. And then now they have a tool that is called Optimist. It's open source, it's web-based, 99% automated. It runs with Planter on the web, and data coming from Planter softwares. And then it is automated enough that the tool can run in the country offices with personnel with only supply chain background and nothing on the optimization background. And some anecdotes from the 2017 annual report. So they're running it, and I'm very proud of this. If you can actually see in their annual report, they actually have a phrase that's called mathematical algorithms. I mean, this was unthinkable 10 years ago, So like now we're at a stage where we can actually bring in this as a success story, promoting mathematical algorithms and optimize supply chain setups. I mean, this is really great. Some other things, in 2016, in the Iraq operations, the tool was fully used, saving, 17% of the cost over a year ago. And I know currently that they have been using it in a couple of countries on country operations as well. So Ethiopia is the country that gets the largest food aid in the world. And they've been using it within the Ethiopian office, saving, they claim that it saves millions of dollars per month just in Ethiopia. How about the advanced prepositioning, advanced purchasing? And also, again, from the 2017 annual report, they actually promote advanced positioning, pre-purchasing, and the financing mechanism that they have is called the Global Commodity Management Facility. Okay? And then they also say that this mechanism saves them millions of dollars, reduces 10 days of lead time on average, and so on and so forth. I didn't start my... apparently, I wasn't able to start my stopwatch. How much time do I have? Are you looking? Or you're going to let me just talk? Okay, because I can just talk. Okay. You know, I'm a professor. I can just talk forever. So I just want to say a few words about, so what's next? You know, like what are, so that was, I would say that was a big success story for me, but it took 10 years. Not many highly regarded publications, but I feel very content about my relationship with WFP and what we were able to achieve there. So I would also say that that also then leads into a lot of other things. So the WFP work, for example, now I work with many different offices within WFP. And for example, one of the things I would say that I've been doing recently is I've been working with their human resources and their personnel reassignment. And we're doing some really cool matching work in their personnel reassignment. And I think actually the math in there will get some good publications. So, you know, sometimes you go and you solve some problems that are not so challenging in terms of math, but then that leads you into other problems that could be really, really interesting from a methodological point of view as well. So also you build a reputation. So now I'm working with USAID on their Food for Peace supply chains. It's exactly the same story. This food aid quality review project that USAID has been doing for like 10 years has been looking at effectiveness of their food aid. This is the third phase of the project. Somebody finally decided that, oh, somebody should look at supply chains as well. So nobody was looking at supply chains when they were looking at their food aid effectiveness. So I got called in the last phase and to look into supply chains, thankfully. And it's been really, really interesting, but it's also been kind of the same story. We're working with people who have almost no technical backgrounds, but supply chain people who are really believers that things can be done better. We have started with doing a lot of data analysis. We've looked at 6 years of procurement and logistics data. We have shown things that are common sense, things like, you know what, ocean freight cost and capacities are variable. Commodity prices and availability are variable. So maybe you should do some systematic purchasing and do some advanced purchasing and prepositioning. So there are a lot of, for example, some of the other interesting things that we've been showing them just through data analysis was things like, if you know the Jones Act, which tells that US flagships, a certain percentage of all the aid that US does has to be carried with US flagships. We were able to show them, like, you're actually buying your US flagship ocean transportation at the worst possible times. You can actually do this in a much better way. And then we're also doing things with respect to, you know, you should do planning with a longer time horizons than 2 to 3 months. We've been able to develop a tool, you know, some frameworks, tools, and currently we're at the point where we're showing them, you know what, here's a 25% savings opportunity if you're actually planning for 6 months in advance rather than 2 to 3 months in advance. But we have exactly the same types of roadblocks or the requirements as we've seen in WFP. You have to do advanced purchasing, which is a really organizational mind shift. You have to do large-scale data tracking and analysis. And then you really need to use supply chain optimization type of tools to make effective decisions when you're actually operating a supply chain at the global scale. And one thing that's good is like they've just decided to extend our contract. So I think we're making them believe that we're doing something useful. I think that's all I wanted to say. And I wish I had seen your FEMA question before, because I would have, that's one question that I've been thinking about for a long time lately. But thank you.
It's true that all these questions were not quite random in nature. Okay, so thank you very much, Özlem. So our next speaker is Ed Kaplan. So Ed also graduated from MIT, and after a short journey at Harvard and UMass, he joined the faculty at Yale University. So please welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. You can hear me okay? So I'm just reminded of a few things being back at MIT. First, my advisor, Dick Larson, is sitting right up there. I spent last night at the Marriott, all right? Coming from the Marriott here isn't easy. But luckily, I remember studying Dick's paper co-authored with Victor Anquak Lee, which was shortest path in the presence of barriers. And it's a good thing I knew how to do this, because I would have never found here. Secondly, I can always, there are always telltale signs that you're back at MIT. So you walk into this building, and the first thing you see is a sign that says, OR Center event upstairs. That's MIT, take it to the next level. And finally, I have to recall the last time I was here we had a similar gathering. I guess it's been 15 years already, which is sort of hard to believe. But I was quite alarmist at that presentation that we were facing a crisis in operations research. The crisis was that the Red Sox were falling apart, and it was all Dimitris's fault, because Dimitris had written this paper, which included the memorable line, "A player is a vector of numbers." And that's exactly what happened. The Red Sox that year, the vectors of numbers weren't cooperating. But Dimitris has figured out since then that if a player is a vector of numbers, then a team is a matrix of players. And of course, you can optimally rotate the matrix, and that was good for the Red Sox rotation, mean field evaluations, and they were mean in the field, and okay, you get the idea. So, to the topic. Way to go, Dimitris. We won the World Series. That's the greatest result from MIT OR in years. Especially given Tom's pitching prowess, but okay. So we're supposed to be talking about operations research and public policy here. So the way I think about this is if you actually take a look at where OR came from, it started, of course, with the study of military operations and what could be more public policy than the military. A lot of the original applications were very, very tactical in nature. I mean, really, really narrow. For example, if you are on a warship in the Pacific and you are targeted by a kamikaze pilot, is the best thing to try evasive maneuvers so that you can somehow or another dodge the diving plane and it goes into the water in flames? Or should you instead try to stay as calm as possible so that you get your best shot and try and shoot the plane out of the sky? That's an actual problem that was studied by operations researchers during the Second World War. Sometimes the trade-offs were a little bit bigger. For example, how should you allocate bomber patrols when trying to protect your merchant convoys, which are being attacked by Nazi U-boats? But maybe instead of trying to optimally deploying the bombers to go after the U-boats when they're in the process of going after your convoys, maybe you should just bomb the U-boat docks where they're being produced and maintained and serviced, which is going to give you the bigger return. And of course, there are a zillion more examples like this, and if you haven't done it, I'd urge you to buy the book or rent the book or take the book out of the library or look at it online, Morrison Kimball's original book on methods of operations research, because there are a lot of examples like this that are discussed in quite a bit of detail, where you can not only learn the story, but you can actually see the analysis that these folks were able to do at the time with obviously a tiny fraction of the technology that we have at our hands today. And of course, ultimately, the goal behind many, if not most, of these exercises was to try and avert Allied casualties, minimize harm, maximize lives saved, at least on the Allied side. Now, Fast forward a little bit. So I grew up in an environment where making the world a better place was a pretty common topic of discussion at home, in the synagogue, at school, all over. You know, wouldn't it be better if things were better? Very simple thought. I also happen to like math. I'm not by any means the only person who's got that combination of attributes. There are lots of people who like math. There are lots of people who want to make the world a better place. I'm happy to say that actually Informs now agrees with that sentiment. And so there's a strategic goal of the organization, which all of you should be familiar with, which is that operations, research, and analytics will be deployed to make the world a better place. That's actually one of the official goals of our organization. But back to the question here, which was, what is public policy, why OR? What is about OR which is so good for policy work? Especially when you consider that there are lots of quantitative types who can get attracted to working on public policy problems. Economists who do a lot of this, statisticians do a lot of this, engineers, computer scientists, mathematicians, all of them have gotten involved in one way or another in working on these policy problems. But I would still argue that OR has one advantage over these other fields, and it really goes back to the founding of the field, which is that operations research is about research on operations. It's actually about modeling processes, and a huge part of public policy is actually about doing stuff as opposed to just talking about stuff. So one can kind of conduct thought experiments, and one can get into political arguments about this would be better or that would be better, or one can instead try to actually do things. Now that can start at the level of building models, which basically try to understand the processes, the overall processes in which the policy questions are taking place, and then try to embed the policy decisions in those processes. Or it can become more narrow, in some ways a cousin to those early studies during the Second World War, where you deploy operations research methods to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular program or of a particular policy in a particular place and see whether or not indeed you are saving lives, saving money, doing whatever it takes to make the world a better place. So when I think about using operations research, that to me is the big advantage. And as I said, there's really sort of two of them to me. One is that there's this changing of the mindset which comes about by trying to understand the basic processes, the basic environment in which the policy debates are taking place. And secondly, to actually go out and do stuff, to actually show how you can implement things and how you can analyze them. Now, before I go any further, I have a single slide which I would like to call into play right now. There it is. And what we have here is a synopsis, a selected sample of President's Award winners. And the President's Award is, I think you know, is Inform's award for people who have essentially had a societal impact, society with a capital S. And what we have here are, first of all, many MIT graduates are on this list, but I think, although this is by no means a random sample, it's certainly not an exhaustive sample, but I think what it does do is illustrate some of the points that I've been trying to make, and it also, I think, echoes a lot of what John had said earlier. So if we just take a look across this list for a second, let me try and just do my own data mining, as it were, and extract a few features from this. So the first is, as John said in his presentation, most of the people on this list became substantive experts in whatever it was they were studying. Al Blumstein is as well known, perhaps even better known in this world as a criminologist as an operations researcher. Arnie Barnett, when it comes to aviation safety. Jan Chaikin, Dick in urban services, and we can go through here. Jerry Brown at the very end in 2016, the award, world expert in military OR, all aspects of it. John, world expert in drug policy, all aspects of it. So there is a lot of truth to this notion that if you want to have an impact in the policy world, you can't really think of parachuting in, just doing one little thing because the math says this is the best thing to do, that's it, and go away. You have to learn how to talk to the substantive experts in their own language. You have to learn how to talk to the decision makers in their own language. I certainly learned this lesson when I was doing the HIV/AIDS stuff. I had never taken an epidemiology class in my life. I knew nothing, really, about infectious disease. I knew a little bit about queuing theory. It turned out that actually those two things have a lot in common and made it possible to learn the language and go forward from there. So it's very, very important to to be able to speak to people in terms that they understand, and it's very important for you, the OR person working in policy, to actually know the subject area quite thoroughly. Some of these contributions, as I said, mainly come about through thought shaping. So if we go back to Al Blumstein, one of the things that he's best known for is this whole notion of a criminal careers paradigm. Until he had done that work, that's simply not how people thought of crooks. People thought of crooks as bad guys. But the idea that actually there is a life cycle, as it were, there's such a thing as a criminal career, one can actually statistically, by following cohorts over time, see what crime commission rates look like as a function of age. Having that fundamental knowledge and having some very simple process models for that information turns out to be important. If I want to know how many crimes I'm going to avert by putting somebody in jail for 5 years or for 10 years, it depends where they are in that life cycle. It depends what would be going on if they were on the outside as opposed to the inside. So some of the work which came out of that actually led to proposals for differential sentencing, what was called selective incapacitation, and so on. Now, again, if we take a look at something like say, urban services. So here's a case where Dick and other people who had worked at the New York City Rand Institute since then really were able to take a look at these systems and say, I suppose in a cousin to how Özlem talked about the food program, where she said, we know about supply chains, and now we're going to look at this totally different thing. So people knew about queuing systems, people knew about service systems in general. People hadn't, until this work, really characterized police departments, fire departments, emergency medical services as spatially distributed queuing systems, as service systems, and dealt with them as such. And simply having that initial insight made it possible to do all sorts of analyses, which up until now had been handled in fairly rote fashion. How should we, allocate police officers over space and over time if what we're really trying to do is to achieve some kind of performance measures? Maybe it's minimizing response time, for example. Instead, in an environment where up until then, basically everyone had the same 8-hour tours and the city was sort of divided up evenly, and spatial analysis led to officers being allocated to parts of the city in proportion to crime rates and things like this. So a lot of things changed from that. Now, it's a two-way street. It's not just a question of studying policy and then going out and hoping you have an impact, or working really hard to try to have an impact. Actually, what often comes out of these studies is more OR, more methodology, more theory, and I think that's also exhibited by several of the entries on this list. Sometimes, and this isn't what happens at all the majority of the time, but sometimes people have actually turned into the decision makers. And so we have the interesting case of Lou Riccio, who is the commissioner for New York City Department of Transportation. Before that, he was the assistant commissioner for the Department of Sanitation. I think he was an Edelman finalist, if not an award winner, but I think he was an Edelman finalist for polishing the Big Apple, which was basically how to do optimal street sweeping in New York. These days, I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I've seen him referred to as the Nate Silver of infrastructure, quote unquote, and to have invented the field of pothole analytics, as opposed to John, who invented pothead analytics. But anyway, here's a case where someone trained in OR, who to this day maintains a teaching appointment in industrial engineering and operations research at Columbia, actually went out and made these decisions and was able to do that. Another person who had some fair bureaucratic, in a leadership role, bureaucratic experience, and I mean that in a good way, as in head of the bureau, Jan Chaikin. Jan Chaikin, also a member of that so influential New York City Rand Institute group, went on to work for the Department of Justice Statistics as their director. He was actually quite important in developing the whole FBI's incident reporting system, also in pulling together the computer systems in a way which make it possible to track criminals and find people much more quickly. So we have all of these examples here, which are showing these different ways. Now, there is one other thing which is kind of interesting about this list, which is that if you think about it, virtually everybody here went from methods to application. That is to say, these people got their background degrees in OR or related, mathematics, say, or engineering. But they came first from the methods and then went to the application instead of the other way around. And there's an interesting question as to how that happened. And we don't have the time, and I actually don't know the answers to all of these. But it's instructive to ask sort of what were, in some sense, the make or break events that got different people involved into these different situations. In some cases, it may have indeed been from, just general interest in the field. I want to know more about it. Like you get into it, you get to the point where you can actually do something about it. But I would argue that in a lot of these cases, it was quite serendipitous. There was an event that happened by chance. Some of these problems fell into our laps. I know that's Dick's case. If he could tell you about grand larceny involving larceny, certainly is my case on several different issues. In the original work in public housing, when it was actually the girlfriend of the boyfriend of a classmate of mine at MIT, who was a consulting architect to a tenants group in the Boston Housing Authority, and basically came to me with this problem, which is what turned into a whole bunch of public housing research. And similarly with the HIV/AIDS stuff, the whole needle exchange program fell in my lap. It fell in my lap because there was a professor at Yale who also happened to be the chair of the mayor's task force on AIDS, who walked in my office one day and said, the governor just signed needle exchange legislation. You've got to do something about this. And so things like this just sort of happen, but they're more likely to happen if you prepare the ground. In other words, you kind of have to have your antenna out, and you have to be well trained so that if such an opportunity shows up, you can kind of work with it and pounce on it. Okay. So, I guess what I would say here is that this is a pretty impressive list, and as I said, it's not exhaustive by any means. But I think it's wonderful to have up there. I get excited just looking at what different people in our field have done. And there's nothing to say that there isn't just as much, if not more, to do. By the way, and with more modern methods, of course, can come the ability to work on different kinds of problems. I guess the last thing I want to say is I want to make a distinction between doing policy research and having a societal impact. They're not exactly the same thing, because you can make the world a better place in a lot of different ways, and public policy is one way to do it. You can affect a large number of people at one point. But you know what? I would argue that the people who have, for example, revolutionized transit so that it's just so much easier for us to take cars where we want by calling up Uber has made life better for us too. And obviously revolutionary approaches in healthcare, which are extending lives and reducing morbidity and mortality, have made life a lot better for us too. There's a tremendous amount that can go on that's not necessarily in the public sector, which can make the world a better place. So if that's sort of what your main goal is in life, there are a lot of different ways you can do that. Nonetheless, working on problems that obviously affect large numbers of people by design is a very rewarding way to go. I will say one more time that a lot of my best adventures in this area did fall in my lap, but I did feel incredibly well prepared, both by the methodological grounding I had here at MIT, and also just because of my general upbringing, that it was possible to jump onto these things. And what can I say? I'd highly encourage others to do the same. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And our next speaker is Larry Vine. So Larry graduated from Stanford. He spent quite some time on the faculty here at MIT before returning back to Stanford. So I'll pass it over to Larry.
Thank you, Nikos. It's a great pleasure. I mean, in my opinion, I think most of us, the OR Center at MIT is one of the greatest institutions in the history of our field, so it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to come and celebrate its birthday with you here. And before I get rolling, I just want to reiterate that MIT has played a pioneering role in public sector work, and I think all of us here, and just say that Dick Larson and Arnie Barnett really have been great inspirations to us, and have really in some sense, I was thinking pioneering it, and then I thought a few more minutes about it, and like a lot of things in the OR field, if you go back far enough, it all goes through John Little's career. And one of the first public sector papers I ever read was on synchronizing traffic lights from John from, I'm not sure what year, 1960 or late 50s. So it's great to see John in the room. So what I'm going to do, I have to say, being the fourth person up here, it's going to be rather redundant, so I apologize in advance for that. And in particular, I think what John and Ed said, I'll be echoing some of those things. But I'm going to take a little bit different look and just kind of talk about the process of how I do the research and think about what helped get things, kind of focus on implementation, what factors helped get things implemented, what factors hindered things from getting implemented, how have I slowly learned over the years to do this. So I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but this is a list of what I would call successful implementations, and that the direct recommendations out of our papers were implemented, in this case, all of them nationwide. The first 5 of these are Homeland Security, so post-attack mass vaccination for smallpox, post-attack antibiotic distribution using the US Postal Service, changing the pasteurization formula, intensifying it for milk in this country, changing the fingerprint program at the airports from 2 to 10 fingers, post-attack strategy if a nuclear bomb goes off from selective evacuation to shelter in place. And then the last one is more recent, and that's on crime, of switching to basically 100% processing of all cartridge cases for ballistic imaging to solve gun crimes. So here's a few less successful, here's a slide with some less successful implementations. The first 3, I would say, had some partial implementation. So the first was actually done was part of Rebecca D'Amato's thesis here at the OR Center, which led to a successful HIV clinical trial in Europe, and for a little while was was best practice in Europe. And I would call that partial because of the nature of the field. It kind of was used for a year or 2, and then the field is just moving so fast and new drugs coming in and all that it played its role and became obsolete. The second one, on the flu pandemic, we convinced the FDA to approve N95 respirators in the event, for pandemic flu, but were unable to really get what we really wanted, was nationwide stockpiling of them in the event of a pandemic. The third one is the India biometric program for social inclusion, which involves over 1 billion citizens from India, and they implemented a 2-stage policy which was inspired by our work but did not directly implement our algorithms from our paper. The next 2, I would say, had some influence in thinking, but was no real implementation. So around 2008, when the Obama administration was really trying to get comprehensive immigration reform, they brought our mathematical model in-house to help look at that. And then my work on anthrax decontamination after an event led to more funding for anthrax decontamination. But again, none of the algorithms from these 2 papers were implemented in any way. And then I'd see these last 2 may have influenced somebody's thinking somewhere along the line, but from what I can tell, were not implemented at all. Nuclear detection at the ports, which was a number of papers, 3 or 4 papers on detecting nuclear weapons trying to be smuggled in, and then kidney transplants, which was Stefanos Zenios' thesis here at MIT. So for each of these, I kind of thought about, what were the factors that led to successful implementation? What were the factors that led to partial or no implementation? And so I'm going to have 2 slides here, and one of them is about doing the research, and the other slide is about disseminating the research after we do it. So on doing the research, I think the biggest thing is just choosing the right problem. And I spend an inordinate amount of time. I'm embarrassed to tell you how much time I spend thinking about, trying to find new problems. This slide was kind of from some Homeland Security work, but I think it's important. You have to have a problem that's important. In this case, it was kind of catastrophic, meaning, maybe 100,000 deaths on US soil. And then a key one is whether it's insufficiently addressed in the literature and by policymakers. And often I'll find a problem that, a few months ago was one which I was really excited about, the idea of, I don't know if you read about the Golden State Killer, but they use ancestry databases to actually indirectly catch these killers. And I thought, wow, this is really going to change the whole crime field, and started reading about it. And I've already knew population genetics from some earlier work on genetically modified mosquitoes, and a lot of it is probability and statistics. And then at the last minute, right before I was ready to jump in, I found one more paper, and it led to some blog on a website from a guy at UC Davis, and he did just a beautiful analysis of this, and just, there's no reason to try to jump in after that. And then, fun is probably not the right, I should change that word when you're talking about Homeland Security, but I mean something that you're really passionate about, and something that's ideally challenging mathematically. And then after finding a problem, a key part for me has been contextual learning. So very few public policy problems are OR problems. You can't just kind of stick them into stochastic dynamic program or linear program or whatever your favorite tool is. And there's often a lot of other stuff going on. And for a lot of these problems in Homeland Security, at least in the government, there's teams of PhDs that are specialists in these other areas. So I felt like there were two approaches. I could either team up with someone who was already, an expert on this, or I could learn it myself. And for the most part, I decided on the latter course of just learning this stuff myself. And then, some of these problems is, as Ed was saying there, and John, these are operations problems, but they also have, these other things in them. And the other part is really the data. You really have to look hard and get all the data. And sometimes it's easy to do. So there's a 1,500-page book on the effects of nuclear weapons. There's a 1,000-page book on smallpox eradication. So they give you everything you ever want to know about these topics. Other times we had to start from scratch, and it was harder to do. Sometimes they're just insufficient data. And then you have to decide, what kind of sensitivity analysis, or how do we even approach this when there's stuff that's so unknown. And once in a while, there's actually classified data, and then you have to think about, how am I going to deal with this? And I would say besides the data, there's, these public policy problems often hinge on issues that aren't in the model. And so it's really important, if we're going to seriously do public policy research, to understand all of these issues, understand, even though if they're not in the model, how your model, in particular your proposed recommendations, will either exacerbate or mitigate some of these issues. And then occasionally, I sought out co-authors that were experts in areas, and for one of usually two reasons. Sometimes some of these areas, there's just no data in the public domain. You can't Google the data, you can't find it in journals, and the only way is to just find someone who really knows this stuff. And so, for example, Steve Flynn was, kind of the world's expert on container security, and so I engaged him in this. Marty Beggs was is a police forensic expert in Stockton, California, who I wrote papers with. And the other reason is data. That, for example, with Marty Beggs, there's just no way to get data on ballistic imaging without just going into a police department and getting them to share your data and work with them. And lastly, I'd say this is something I think I've learned slowly over the years, and Ed and I kind of learned this some together, and you can kind of, even though Ed didn't go into it, you could see this in his recent immigration work. But often in public policy, you're kind of choosing between a few key options, and then you do the analysis, and it's clear one of these options dominates the other option. And I found that it's best to then kind of go back and take the option that you're going to recommend and just underestimate it as much as you can. Just give the most conservative estimate in kind of a lower bound, because you know it's still, even after all these assumptions, it's still going to come out better than the other option, because there's going to be people on the other side of this policy issue that are going to try to poke holes through your arguments, and the more bulletproof you can make it, the better off you are. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to the factor, that was all on how to do the research, and now I'm going to talk about dissemination. So I think it's helped some of just being self-funded. The Graduate School of Business, Stanford would just give me money. So a key part is, something like Homeland Security that, was suddenly after the September 11th attack is, I wouldn't call it necessarily a hot topic, but it was, a pressing policy issue. The government had to quickly make a bunch of decisions very quickly. And Ed and I were able to just jump into this very quickly, whereas if we had to wait and write an NSF grant and get money, and you kind of wait 18 months and 2 years later, and you've kind of missed the boat. And so I feel like I've been very fortunate in that. And I think sometimes if you get money from funding agencies, they want to take ownership of the research and they want to disseminate it upstream. And I think it can get easier access and more direct access just doing it yourself. And I think if one's not that if you're funded, especially by something like National Science Foundation, not that you have an agenda, but certainly showing up in Washington where they don't know who you are and why you're working on this, I think most people kind of viewed me as being impartial on the issues. I think a big help on the implementation factors, and I'll be the first to admit, some of it is just luck and good fortune of getting things in high-profile outlets, in particular journals like the Proceedings National Academy of Sciences. And even though people in the government may not read it, they know that that's a stamp of approval from the basic science agencies of the government and the scientific community. And I think even more so, having an op-ed in a top newspaper like the New York Times or Washington Post or whatnot really influences government thinking. And in particular, it turned out that the threat of an op-ed coming out in the New York Times on botulinum toxin in the milk, which indeed did come out, but the threat of it coming out actually led the government to work with the dairy industry really quickly to implement an intensified heat pasteurization process for milk. And as John had said, I think the goal really is to, the key goal is to educate policymakers. And it was hard on a lot of these problems where I sat to figure out who were the people in power who were really making these decisions. So I would just cast a wide net. And when I finished one of these papers, I basically scheduled 2 full days in Washington and give maybe 10 one-hour talks to all kinds of different people. And I knew that 3/4 of these talks were kind of a waste of time, but I didn't know which ones were going to be a waste of time. And so, just in terms of, these are the first slide again of which ones were implemented, just to give you a sense of the kind of people who, made the decisions or got things done. Ed gave a talk on smallpox to a group of people in the White House, but one of them was a medical expert who was in the inner circle of President Bush at the time, and that ended up being key. And then as I kind of found out several years later that most of these Homeland Security problems during the Bush administration were really getting siphoned through Cheney's office, and he had a big staff and really quite impressive staff. I mean, they were quite senior and very smart. And so I made sure that all these problems I would, even though I had virtually nothing in common with Vice President Cheney politically, I would just, go and spend an hour and brief these people. For anthrax, it was someone on the the National Security Council who read an op-ed in the Washington Post that Ed and I wrote about distributing antibiotics with the Postal Service, and he just thought this was a great idea, and he just ran with it, and it took him 6 or 8 years to actually go through a full implementation, but President Obama signed an executive order in 2010 on this. Botulinum toxin was a little easier. There's an assistant secretary in Health and Human Services who was in charge of this problem. I briefed him, he took me to lunch, and even though he tried to halt publication of my paper, he eventually did implement the heat pasteurization intensification. The US visit, I talked to a bunch of people. I talked to these congressional staff that were basically the same age as my grad students. They didn't really understand what I was doing, and I was just thinking, man, this is a waste of time. But in the end, they got me in front of the committee, and I testified before the Homeland Security Committee on this. And one of the congressmen there, and I didn't find this out till 2 years later, a Congressman Dix, a Republican from Washington State, was hounded the DHS secretary on a weekly basis until he switched from 2 to 10 fingers. On the nuclear stuff, and someone from the National Security Council who also was an expert not just on nuclear stuff, but on bio stuff, so I knew him from the earlier smallpox anthrax work. He kind of got me in there, and they were key. And this last one, to be honest, I'm not even sure how I just found out it got implemented indirectly from my co-author like a month ago. I gave a talk at AFTE, Association for Forensic and Tool Mark Examiners, which are 300 CSI type people that at their annual conference, and there was one person from Department of Justice there, and I talked to him briefly, and he said he had seen my paper, and I'm guessing he was the one that, but I honestly don't know. Okay, so I just have, how am I doing on time? Okay, so I think politics plays a role on a lot of these problems. Sometimes it goes in one's favor, sometimes it goes against you, and you just have to roll with the punches. So for example, on smallpox, I think one could argue that this decision of stockpiling enough smallpox vaccine was during the same time as they thought there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and in the buildup to war in Iraq. And even though that, like for most of us probably think that was quite a questionable thing, the actual, I knew, people whose job it was, like they were on the National Security Council, they had spent 18 months in Iraq actually looking for these weapons. I mean, they clearly thought there probably was some. But at any rate, this may have played a role in the stockpiling of vaccines for smallpox. The US visit was more direct in that this was, I testified 5 weeks before the Bush-Kerry presidential election in 2004, and it was clear the Democrats' main goal of putting me up there was to make the Bush administration look weak on Homeland Security. And, I mean, from my own point of view, I just thought these were the right things to do, and I would just play along. I mean, another thing I don't write here is that I absolutely never talk politics with any of these people, even if they attempted to find out where I stood. I just refused to talk about it. So those two kind of went in my favor. The next one did not, in the sense that Nandan Nilekani, who was co-founder of Infosys, he was running the UIDAI program, this national program for biometrics. And he ran for election, I actually don't know the details, but he ran for election in India and lost, and then the opposing party came into power. And right before it came into power, I had already briefed the head of biometrics for this program, and they loved the work, and they were gonna take the model in-house and calibrate it with their data and implement it, basically. And then right after the election, they basically said, we cannot work with anyone who's not an Indian citizen on this. And so basically stopped working with them. And then the last one, so earlier this year, I did work on sexual assault kits, and the recommendation is to test all 400,000 kits, sexual assault kits in the national backlog. And so I went and talked with a number of people. Again, I spent 2 days in Washington, but in particular, I talked to Representative Zoe Lofgren, US representative from the San Jose area. And she had introduced and passed a bill in 2016 on sexual assault kits. And she really liked the work, and she, in her words, she said, you know, it's kind of like being a running back in a football game. You have to wait for your openings. And she said, if we take the, she's a Democrat, she said, if we take the House back in the midterms, come back and see me. So I'm gonna give them a few more weeks to celebrate, and then I will contact her and see, take her up on this. And then the last point is really to keep the recommendations simple. So I think the math can be complicated, but at some point you have to tell a story about it and you have to simplify it so that the policymakers can understand it. And when I go back and look at the, you know, the things that were less successful in terms of implementation, I would argue that they were too complicated. In particular, the India biometric project, the policy I was really pushing had, you know, 6 or 8 parameters that had to be fine-tuned, and they were going to test it on their data. And then once I couldn't keep working with them, they actually just found it was inspired directly by our paper, but they found a 1-parameter policy that was simpler, and it was a 2-stage policy, and they just went ahead and implemented that because it's much more robust. And in the end, you know, I think that's probably a better policy than the one that I was pushing. I mean, in terms of being robust, in terms of a practical implementation. The US border and the anthrax models are just extremely complicated, as is the nuclear detection stuff. And just as last point here, this is from the ballistic imaging paper. The vertical axis here is the number of hits that you get against the database, which basically gives you a lead to solve a gun crime. The horizontal axis is the percentage of cartridges that are processed, because a lot of cities don't have enough production capacity to process them all. And the black curve is what was currently done, how they currently prioritize and how they do things. We came up with another policy, which is the red curve above, and I really made the big push that it was really simple to do by grouping caliber types to move from the black curve to the red curve in the paper. But I also mentioned that the black curve was essentially y = x squared, and it was increasing returns to scale. And in the end, they actually just implemented 100% processing. Like, and I never dreamed that they would just go ahead and say, oh, increasing returns to scale, let's just process them all. And that's what they did in July, was that the Department of Justice, which essentially subsidizes all of this equipment, said we're gonna only subsidize it in the condition that you process all of your cartridge cases. So I'm still learning from these bad mistakes, even after doing this for 20 years. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone, for the great insights. So I think we have like roughly 5 minutes for questions. So please, if you have any questions for the speakers, you can use the mics on the side.
Given the many years of experience, regarding what would you change in education, what would you change in the curriculum in your corresponding universities and corresponding in here about what we teach and how we teach to our graduate students?
Go ahead, Ed.
I was gonna say, it's a good question. I actually don't think the changes are that major, in the sense that I do think people need to know the methods. However, it's it's often the case that, in fact, I would say it's always the case that there is no course called problem setting, problem framing, problem selection, definition, all of that sort of stuff. And a course where people basically had to, they're thrown into some messy situation which is not well structured. They're given some data. They're given someone who complains there's a problem. There's some angst. How do you even sort of structure the whole thing? That would be a useful class. The closest I think I ever came to a class like that, frankly, when I was at MIT, was actually a course with Herman Chernoff. Herman used to teach in the statistics group within the math department. And he had a semester course which it was called statistical consulting. But really what it was each week someone would come in with a problem that was ill-posed, and just, the whole part wasn't to go off and solve the problem. It was to sort of figure out how to think about it and how to set it up. I think that would educationally be one thing that would help. The other, of course, is most of the kind of work that we're talking about here. I mean, it's not really conducive to its own class in a sense. I mean, I sound like a hypocrite saying this because I teach a course at Yale called Policy Modeling, which actually is pretty popular, but it's not a course for the OR Center. I suppose it could be. It would be pretty souped up. But on the other hand, for people, to have encouragement to pursue this sort of thing for master's thesis, for doctoral thesis topics, for term projects, for courses, I mean, that would be great. It really does take a fair amount of immersion, I think. But I really like the idea of the, figuring out what the problem is part, the sort of problem definition part of it. John?
Yeah, what Ed said.
Except the opposite.
the other class at MIT that I thought came close was Urban Operations and Search. If I were going to add something else, it would be not so much the class, but just filtering on the personality. You've got to be able to go talk to people in the real world. Not everybody can. I don't know if we teach that, but you should know that the interpersonal skills of being able to talk to people who do not know math and are afraid of it is pretty important.
I would second that. I mean, that was my point, just communication and understanding how you need to deal with people who are not in our sphere and how to communicate with them, the fact that who cares, so what, and the who cares, and how to actually, have a long-term engagement.
I've struggled with that question myself, and I think I find the appropriate place the appropriate place to learn it is during the thesis stage, that I just teach it one-on-one to my students as we're doing the research, as opposed to trying to teach it to a class. And there's clear downsides to that, but.
So I'm actually looking at the clock, and just because we have lunch in front of us, may I suggest that we save other questions for the speakers? I also wanted to ask them about how data and maybe social media could affect the way we do research and the way we can affect public policy. But maybe you can ask the speakers over lunch or over dinner the remainder questions.
Just as a reminder, we have lunch. As you exit, go left, and you can follow Laura.
But please, let's thank the speakers one more time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.